UCLA at the Rose Bowl. This will simply suit everyone's hunger for the upcoming football feasts on fall Saturdays. Our hosts Gary Seegars, Kyle Hunter, and Parker Fleming preview the powerful SEC conference, as well as college football odds and contenders for the national championship. In case you missed it, click the link here or head over to our BetUS college football channel, subscribe, and hit the bell to get notified. You're welcome. Hi guys, I'm back to give you a sneak peek on what's going on here at BetUS, and you can always head over to our website to get the full details. Week 1 of the college football season is here, and you know what that means. It's time to play some bets. You can make every bet count with our college and NFL featured and free events. Plus, we just opened our NFL Survivor Pool. Do you have what it takes to be the last player standing? Winner takes it all. And in case you haven't tried out our live betting platform, now it's the time. Try it risk-free with a dollar-for-dollar match up to $100. Kick off the college and pro seasons by getting in on all the football action here at BetUS, where the game begins.
Hey everybody, welcome to the BetUS NFL show. I'm your host, Matt Landis, joined by expert football handicappers LasVegasCris on your left and Scott Kellen on your right if you're watching us on YouTube. Today, we'll be providing a comprehensive preview of the AFC South right here at BetUS, where the game begins. Before we kick things off, I've got one thing to tell you. Make sure to sign up today at BetUS using the promo code NFL2021 to claim your 125% sign-up bonus. That's exclusive for sports betting, good up to $2,500. To take advantage of the offer and get info on the terms and conditions, check out the link below this video. And while you're at it, you can subscribe to this YouTube channel and go ahead and give us a thumbs up if you're enjoying this video. And you know the drill from there. Hit that notification bell to get notified whenever we go live so you don't miss any of the exclusive action we'll be posting. And speaking of going live, special thanks if you're joining us live today. Feel free to jump in on the chat. We want to hear from you and make this as interactive as possible. We'll be going live every Tuesday and Friday throughout the NFL season starting next week. Our schedule will be Tuesdays at 5:30 Eastern, 2:30 Pacific, and Fridays at noon Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific. And Scott, we got some big news today out of New England with the Patriots releasing Cam Newton. What do you think the chances are that we see him starting elsewhere in the league this season, or possibly signing on with a roster in this division we're looking at today, the AFC South?
Well, we'll see, Matt. I think the unfortunate thing for Cam is that this happens so late in the preseason, where teams have almost kind of decided where they're going to go. So I think it's going to be a little tough for him to just fit in and go into a team where he really have the potential to start, obviously immediately, maybe down the road. But there are some teams that could certainly benefit from him being a backup. I've never been a huge Cam guy, but there are teams that could use him and he'd become a somewhat valuable piece to the whole quarterback piece that the teams have. And we're looking at one with Houston, right? That some of these teams that have got young quarterbacks, they're not going to start Cam over the young quarterbacks. But Houston's got a Tyrod Taylor, so that's that kind of team could possibly take advantage of having him on the roster in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, Chris, what do you think about the whole Cam Newton bombshell that we got this morning?
I was a little disappointed because I'm kind of rooting for New England. And I just thought it would be good to have him around. Who knows what happens to this guy? He's got a big salary. I heard some people talking that he may not land anywhere the entire season. I find that hard to believe. I think he'll end up someplace, but it's just too high maintenance, with the COVID issues and just his performance. I don't think people are jumping up and down to grab him.
Yeah, we saw a really strong start for him last season, and then once he tested positive, things really trailed off after that. So worth monitoring to see where Cam catches on. But wherever he ends up, we do have 4 teams to break down in the AFC South today, so we can get to it. kicking things off with the Houston Texans, and we can look at their odds for this upcoming season. I think the number we're going to want to focus on here is that regular season win total at the bottom of this graphic. It's at 4, and that was a low number when we had a 16-game season. So being on 4 regular season wins for the 17-game season, an especially low number, particularly when we look at all that juice to the under, minus 140 on the Texans to come in under 4. So, Scott, it's looking pretty dire for Houston. Do you see any hope for the Texans this season?
I think it's pretty tough here, Matt. My only comment would be, last year they were -9 in turnover margin and literally, only created 3 interceptions and 6 fumbles. Fumbles are random. But from an interception standpoint, just by sheer luck, you would think they would improve in that regard. And Tyrod Taylor has never been a quarterback that throws a lot of interceptions. So from that standpoint, maybe they improve the turnover margin from last year and, possibly gain something there. But short of that, I think it's going to be pretty tough for them to have a whole lot of hope with this team.
Yeah, and I think if we look at some positive regression that could be due for beyond turnovers, if we look at their Pythagorean numbers and their record in close games last year, that could be at least a glimmer of hope for the Texans when we project where they should see things righting the ship a little bit, at least in 2021.
Yeah, if we take a look at their numbers, they win 4 games last year. Their Pythagorean numbers, especially when you extrapolate that out over 17 games, works out to be 6.6 wins, 6.2 in this graph because of 16 games. So they are underachieved, and they were 2-6 in close games. So maybe they get some positive regression from that standpoint. But, I calculate Tyrod Taylor versus Deshaun Watson, probably a 5.5 to 6 point difference in terms of points per game. So, is the drop to Tyrod, is that, what's causing us to go down to about 4 wins from what maybe would have been 6.6 wins? Then throw in the fact that they've got the 3rd toughest schedule in the league. And it just makes it really, really hard to foresee them winning, more than 4 or 5 games. And they've only got 4 games where they're a dog of 5 or less points. So obviously the market and just their opponents are saying that they don't have a great chance to win a whole bunch of games this year.
Yeah, and Chris, I know you mentioned you'll have a theme for each team as we work our way through the division today. You said the Texans were your Britney Spears team this year. I'm wondering if you can elaborate on that for us.
Well, they're the Britney Spears team because, boy, they went out, they had a good time, and boy, they looked like they were having fun and everything was going. But when you really get down to it, they needed somebody to be the conservator and take over for them because they pissed away all their draft picks. They've got nothing, and they need somebody else to come in and manage this team. So that's why they're my Britney Spears team. Scott touched on it all. We don't have to waste a lot of time and fill time. Time's money. So they're not favored a single game the entire season. Watson was great, 33-7, 70%. We can go on and on. They were number 12 offensively for me. He's gone. They have nothing. They were number 30 defensively. They are bringing in 36 veterans. So they're going to be an old team, 60% team turnover. Who are these people? I felt like I was at the airport when you get there really early and you've got all this time and then your flight's late, because when it's like you had all this time to study and it's like, well, there's nothing here. I'm wasting my time. So we don't know what's going to happen to this team. The only bright spot, I love this team. I bet it 12 times last season. I was 8-3-1. And I love this division. So I'm looking forward to hopefully having another good year betting. But as far as that, let's not waste our time.
I love it. I love the passion here. I do have to follow up on that last point you made. You had a really good handle on this division last season. How are you feeling about the AFC South coming into this year? I know that's going to be a hard winning percentage to replicate, but do you feel optimistic about at least approaching, that level of success with the AFC South in 2021?
Oh, I don't think I can predict it. Well, we know I can't do. I know I'm not going to do as well. I was 26-9 in the division overall, which is 74%. I can't keep that up. I know a specific reason. When we get to these next teams, I'll kind of, we might as well just go into the Indianapolis.
Well, since I'll stop you right there. We will get to the Colts, but we have a question in the chat from Birdie, and so this is something we can get to. How is a team that was 1-15, 3-point favorites on the road to anybody? Do you think there is any value on the Texans in Week 1? Very fair question, Scott. I'm inclined to think this might relate to the quarterback change and Houston just being in even more turmoil than Jacksonville these days. But what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's all that, Matt. And then you add in Urban Meyer, Trevor Lawrence, and there's hype around that is probably built into the line as well. It's a really good question because I've run some numbers, and I know obviously we'll hit on this game and take a deeper dive into it next year or next week. But it's a fair question. Some of my numbers would suggest no. I ran another set of numbers that suggest value on Jacksonville. So I think it's a really good question, and I don't think it's completely out of line to think that maybe there's some value with Houston here. That's a big adjustment for a team that was 1-15, and we'll get into Jacksonville here in a little bit as well to talk about what they've done or not done, going into this season as well.
Yeah, and I think that when it comes to Houston, one of my notes for this team was, yes, they're rebuilding. Chris, you touched on all the veterans they brought in. Somehow they still have the oldest roster in the league, despite being, at the pit of a rebuild. And at the same time, it seems like every year there are one or two teams we go into the season with really, really low expectations for, and bad teams win games sometimes. The Texans underperformed their Pythagorean record by 2 games last year. Scott, you touched on 2-6 in close games. So I think, there might be value on Houston, or that line might just be right. These Week 1 openers have been out for a long time, so it might be beat into place right now by some of the sharper people in the marketplace. But Chris, I think one thing I'd like to follow up on that you said to put a bow on the Texans would be, just wondering who these guys are. I think of my favorite movie, Major League, when there's the construction crew at the beginning of the movie looking at the opening day roster, and there's, who the hell are these guys? That's kind of what it feels like with Houston this year. And if we want to know who these guys are, we might just have to wait and see for a bit.
Well, I when I saw Jacksonville up to a 3-point favorite, I really want to justify playing Houston. I thought to myself, there has to be a way to play Houston here. There's just no way you can justify playing Jacksonville. And I'm not going to say I'm not going to be on Houston, but I'm having a hard time figuring out how I can be.
Yeah, well, like Scott said, we can dive into this game in a little more detail next week. But yeah, Birdie, thank you for the comment. Good question, and it's something we'll ponder and probably circle back on when we take a deeper dive at the Week 1 slate. I think that's about all we've got to offer you guys on the Houston Texans. We can move on to the Indianapolis Colts, and let's take a look at some of their odds for the upcoming season. Here, I do think it's fair not just to look at the regular season win number, but to win the division. The Colts are at plus 130. Their regular season win total is a flat 9. And when it comes to the Colts, Chris, we know the supporting cast was an issue for Carson Wentz throughout his time in Philadelphia. We were thinking we might get a clear answer this year in Indianapolis, whether the cast was a bigger problem than Wentz himself. But with injury issues and the COVID reserve list growing for the Colts, it looks like that supporting cast might be an issue for Carson Wentz once again this season with the Colts.
Well, speaking of cast, this is my MASH unit because it just fits the profile. Obviously, MASH had new characters come and go, just like Indianapolis has. MASH was a TV show that you either loved or you hated it. It just, and I feel the bettors either love Indianapolis or they hate Indianapolis. And then, of course, the obvious, they're the medical team with all the injuries surrounded by just difficulty. So that's why they're my MASH unit. But I loved them last year. I bet them 13 times. Went 9-3 with one push. And I'd love to bet them all year long again. But, we're just going to have to see. They were just a monster team last year. They flew under the radar. Nobody respected them. They overvalued their weak schedule. And I got a lot of value with Indianapolis last year. So their big weakness is their pass defense at 66%. And that's something that they need to improve on, but they didn't do anything to work on that. They had a horrible draft. And this revolving door of injuries is too hard to keep up on. And you look at the first 5 games of the season, Seattle, the Rams, Tennessee on the road, Miami on the road, Baltimore on the road. They don't have a bye until week 14 to recenter themselves. This whole division, to answer your question, I think I'm going to be hands off. I want to see what happens to all these teams. As much as I loved Indianapolis, I'll turn on her in a moment. I'll pivot. I'll bet against her like that. So I go where the value is. And I just can't bet on anybody right now in this division, quite frankly, I don't think.
Yeah, I'll try to note the injuries you alluded to just to give a decent overview to the audience tuning in here. The latest tally I've got, you talk about them being a MASH team. If we look at the offensive line, all-pro left guard Quentin Nelson working his way back from a foot injury. He also spent a stint on the COVID reserve list. Also along the offensive line, new left tackle Eric Fisher rehabbing an Achilles injury, and he's also missed some time after testing positive for COVID a couple of weeks ago. When it comes to depth on the line, even a guy like Sam Tevy was completing to replace Fisher at the start of the season at left tackle. He tore an ACL, so he's out for the season. And it's going to be big shoes for someone to fill at left tackle because Anthony Costanzo was there for a decade, and he was a Pro Football Focus top 10 offensive tackle 4 of those seasons. So we're going to, at least hope that Carson Wentz can get some good protection up front, but it's to be determined who provides that protection for him. And in terms of the guys he's going to be throwing the ball to, again, this sounds awfully familiar going back to his time in Philly. Leading wide receiver T.Y. Hilton likely out for the start of the season with a neck and back injury. And beyond these injuries, if we look at the COVID reserve list for the Colts right now, still focusing on that offensive line and wide receiver core that Carson Wentz is going to be leaning on. Center Ryan Kelly, currently on the COVID list. He's a 2-time Pro Bowler, also working his way back from an elbow injury. Wide receiver Zach Pascal, who plays a meaningful role in the offense, currently sidelined. And Wentz himself, he was set to return to full team drills for the first time since his foot surgery at the beginning of the month. That was going to happen yesterday, but now he's landed on the COVID list. So chemistry is going to be a major question for this team. Scott, how quickly do you think the Colts are going to be able to piece it together with all these moving parts and question marks popping up this late in the offseason?
Well, that's a good question, Matt. And Chris hit on it. First 5 games are tough. Then they get a little bit of a break. They play Houston, and then along comes San Francisco and Tennessee. So 7 of their first 8 games are going to be extremely challenging. And if they don't have their ducks in a row and cards in order, it is going to be tough. And, obviously Wentz had a lot of success with Frank Reich back in Philly. So there's some hope from that standpoint. In theory, you'd think the offensive line would be better, and that can be partly to blame for all of Carson's problems in Philly, especially last year. But some of this is on him, and how much of this is in his mind yet as well. You could watch those games last year, and you could just see, really not to a fault of his, that a lot of this is just in his mind. And so how quickly can he get that out of his mind as well is a big thing, I think, as well.
Yeah, and I'd like to follow up on the point you mentioned about Wentz reuniting with Frank Reich. That's a big storyline. And of course, that could make all the difference in the world. But at the same time, looking at Wentz last year, he led the league with 15 interceptions and 50 sacks, and that came in just 12 games. So when it comes to Wentz reuniting with Frank Reich, how much do you expect that to kind of cover up a lot of the flaws that we saw when it came to Wentz's performance in 2020?
Well, a lot of the flaws, who knows? I will say this too, Phillip Rivers had one of his better years with Reich last year as well. So, maybe there's something to be said from that standpoint in terms of what Frank Reich can do and the system that they run, et cetera. So you hope that helps him a little bit. But kind of like Chris, Chris said, I think on one of our first shows, hurry up and wait. Let's just take a wait and see attitude a little bit here and just see what we truly have. And has Carson turned it around at all? There's no rush, right? And the beauty of the NFL, unlike maybe season wins that we're talking about here, is every week you get a chance to evaluate and you can bet on or against. So, let's kind of see. And the other thing here is with their first 5 games being really tough and 7 out of 8, if we don't like what we see early on, we're going to get some fairly equal opponents in the weeks to come after that game. So, we'll have a chance to go against or play on, based on what we're seeing from the team as a whole.
Yeah, and I want to take a moment, Scott, to also pull up the Colts Pythagorean numbers. You mentioned hurry up and wait, Chris. That's been a mantra that you've preached, and I think very astutely so this offseason. But as we start to maybe not fire bets on the Colts or this division quite yet, still start to formulate what we're going to look for and where we'll be ready to adjust once the season gets going. Scott, when it comes to the Colts Pythagorean numbers, their record in close games, their schedule this year, what are you looking at in terms of how quickly you're going to make a move on or against the Colts this season?
Yeah, I mean, we look from last year, they had 11 wins on the season. Their Pythagorean, we can see in the chart there, came in at 10. And when we extrapolate that out now, because we're playing 17 games, we're at 10.7. So pretty much in line with the 11. But of course, we've set their number a little bit lower on the over-under season wins. They were 4-2 in close games, not a whole lot to take from there. And their schedule 26, so fairly easy schedule for them as well. But when we look at, the lines that have been created for all 18 weeks of the season, it puts us at 9.6 wins. So pretty neutral as a whole in terms of their over-under season wins and kind of what we see with these numbers. Not a whole lot to gain from there. I think it's more of we just got to see how quickly this team comes together as a whole and plays before we can really form a whole lot of opinions on them. And ironically, where Chris said this has been the easiest team for him to handicap, whether it's last year or over previous years, this is one of the teams for me. I've always had a real trouble handicapping and just never felt like I've had a good sense of where they're going to be on a week-by-week basis. So I think it's funny, how some people see the team as very easy and some see it as being very difficult. And hopefully I can see a little bit more of Chris's mind in this team in the near future.
Well, you're not alone in this, though, Scott. I mean, I feel like I was on a little mini island because I argued Indianapolis all last year with people, and I argued that Rivers was a much better quarterback. I mean, everybody said Rivers was garbage, and he was top 10 in so many categories. He was really, really good. It's the first time when he's been behind a good offensive line, so he had time to throw the ball. Here's another silly statistic, and you guys can make fun all you want. Remember, I was 9-3. Indianapolis, I had rated as the fourth best team in the NFL last year. So you can laugh all you want, but it brings me winners. You can laugh that I had Cleveland rated so low. I won betting against them. You can laugh I had Chicago rated above Cleveland, but I had a 6-3 record with Chicago. So something's got to be right. And to answer your question, Scott, I think it's really just looking at the statistics and seeing that they're just well-rounded and well-coached and veteran and a cohesive unit that is just consistent. And sure, the wheels fell off the bus a couple of times, and they got lucky with that big Green Bay comeback. That was a disaster, but they were a quality team, and boy, am I going to miss them because I don't think they're going to be as good this year, no matter what they do.
No, but yeah. I'll say this, Chris, going into the game, you always know when you've got like a Frank Wright that you're at least in a decent position. You know that decisions that are going to be made are probably correct. And, the game plan has a chance to succeed and all that. And obviously it doesn't always play out that way in the field, but that's a huge thing when you're betting on or against them to kind of know where they're coming from just from that standpoint.
I knew this team so well. I remember it was a crucial game for me later on in the season. And they were playing Houston, I think it was. And Houston had the ball inside the 5-yard line with like 15 seconds to go. And it was just going to ruin my weekend. And I literally wasn't even worried. I wasn't worried. I'm like, yeah, that's going to screw me. It's going to be really tough. It's, I'm going to be, like getting kneecapped. But they're going to stop them. They're going to stop them. Not worried. Obviously, I think Watson fumbled right there at the 2 or something. But it just knew some way, somehow, when a good team is going to come away with a win.
Yeah, that game reminds me of probably one of my luckier total wins of all time, let alone last season. I believe I had the under. I had the under in that game, and I believe it was within a field goal or a touchdown of cashing at halftime. If memory serves, I think there was a safety, and that's about it in the second half. So really had to thread the needle to come out with the win there. But the Colts definitely rewarded you and me both, Chris, at certain times last year. I'll be curious to see the kind of read that all three of us can get on Indianapolis in 2021. I think we can move on to the next team, and with Jacksonville, the thought I have is that no matter how good of a read or how poor of a read any of us have had on them in the past, that all kind of goes out the window. They have some new faces in new places we can touch on after we look at their odds for the coming season. I think we can focus on their division win number plus 650, and their regular season win total 6.5, juiced a good bit to the under. And when we're looking at the Jags, Scott, what are your expectations for year one of the Urban Meyer and Trevor Lawrence regime?
Well, I think the question here, Matt, comes in is how much do they pick up from Trevor Lawrence versus Gardner Minshew? They've added a few pieces to the puzzle in the secondary, but their defense was horrible last year, allowing 153 yards rushing per game. They averaged just over 1 sack per game. And the offensive line's not bad, but they did average just under 3 sacks allowed last year. So what are they getting? And Minshew only played, 5, 6, 7 games last year, and then they had a few other quarterbacks play that were worse than Gardner Minshew. But Gardner Minshew had a 1.4% interception rate. I got to believe Trevor Lawrence, no matter how good he is, just being a rookie quarterback, he's going to be higher in his interception rate than what Minshew was. And now the other quarterbacks were obviously much worse. They'll probably get a little bit better yards per pass out of Lawrence. They've actually got some receivers here. They could actually move the ball, especially if they can protect Trevor Lawrence. And, he's got some mobility as well. Maybe that helps as well. I just don't know how much they've really done on defense. And this defense was horrible last year. So I just don't know how much better their defense is going to be. With that said, though, this division, it has a chance to be very, very average. And they could just pick up some wins just because of that. And here's the other thing, which is just kind of shocking. Jacksonville, I believe, their only win last year, by the way, was week 1 at home against Indianapolis. Maybe a little bit of a false win for them, but they got the win. They have defeated Indianapolis at home. I believe it's 6 straight years in a row, definitely 5, maybe 6 years in a row. I don't know what you take from that, and they've had a couple of those years where they were decent teams. But for some reason, they've had their number at home for whatever reason. And, this division is just bad enough that maybe they can pick up some other wins as well.
Yeah, when it comes to that angle, I'm wondering if that might be part of the storyline. We'll hear sometimes of teams from cold weather climates playing in hot, humid areas early in the season. I know last year it was week 1 where the Colts had to go down to Jacksonville and they lost that one. Obviously, to your point, maybe a bit of a phony win for the Jags. The Colts didn't punt in that game, so the Jags could have easily maybe been 0-16 if we look at it that way. How much of the recent success the Jags have had against a team like the Colts in Florida do you attribute to that early season, hot, humid, shock to the system that it might be for a team like Indy, whereas the Jags, they live in it, so they're used to it?
Well, I do think there's something to hot weather in week 1. Miami is another team, Tampa Bay, obviously. But, I don't know if it was 2 years ago, 3 years ago. I think they beat them fairly late in the season. So, there probably wasn't a lot of heat then relative to what there would be in the early weeks. So, and Jacksonville was slightly better, a few years ago, obviously. And if we look back the last 6 years, there's probably been a few wins that have been later in the year. So, I don't know how much you can put there. I mean, maybe it's week 1, and obviously, Indianapolis made some mistakes and whatnot, clearly, and things can happen, in the early weeks of a season. The Heat certainly, I think, has a play in all that, and any team that's playing down in Florida in week 1. But I don't know if I'd put a lot on that as a whole.
Got it. Well, Chris, I want to work you into the conversation here with the Jags because you've noted that this is the Carla Peller team. Explain to us what you mean by that one.
Where's the beef? Where's the beef? I mean, you got the pretty boy quarterback, and I didn't watch a lot of preseason, but the only time I saw this kid, I see the golden hair like the guy from, California, or Sunshine from Remember the Titans. And what else do they have? Jacksonville. A lot of people I talked to didn't even bet a Jacksonville game last year, oddly enough. I bet them 5 times, and I bet on them 5 times with a winning record. So, they were, believe it or not, they finished 27th and 28th in offense and defense on my metrics, 31st in the league, and they were actually a better team than people realized for a while. I mean, they really fell apart at the end. But they were a playable team for a while. But where's the beef? They've got nothing. I don't think I've heard some of the players complaining about Urban already. The Tebow thing didn't work. They've got. They were outscored. They scored 33 touchdowns last year. They gave up 34 just on passes. So, they had some really extreme stats. They only had 18 sacks and were sacked 44 times. Like Scott said, they gave up 1,000 yards more on the ground than they were able to get. So I can't. It's another situation. They've got one of the easiest schedules. The one thing that goes in their favor is they could technically get it. They've got a really easy start of a schedule with Houston and Denver if they don't live up to expectations. Arizona, I don't know. Cincinnati, I don't know. But they get their bye week early, and that's good for a new head coach where they can make some adjustments and take a little bit of a break after week 6. Other than that, just hurry up and wait. I can't waste any more time on it. There's no way. We don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah, well said. Kind of like Houston, we don't need to beat a dead horse by going overboard on Jacksonville. But you did touch on the schedule, Chris, and I think that could be a nice bridge back to Scott if we want to look at their schedule and some Pythagorean numbers to see where, yes, they were 1-15 last year, but their record could have been a decent bit better than that. And Scott, maybe some of these numbers would go a long ways in answering Birdie's question earlier about how the Jags are 3-point favorites in week 1 despite last season's record.
Yeah, so they go 1-15, as you pointed out, Matt. Their Pythagorean, as we can see on the screen here, is 3.9. If we take that out over 17 games, that would have been 4.2. So that starts to get us, closer to 6.5 wins. And they underachieved by almost 3 wins. They're 1-5 in close games. So, okay, maybe they get some regression there that helps them. 28th toughest schedule. So as Chris alluded to early on in the year, they've got some breaks that maybe can make some hay. I also went back this morning and said, any team that's won 1 game in the previous season, how have they done the next year? And I believe there's been 10 teams that have gone 1-15, and I think 5 or 6 of those 10 actually won 7 or more games the next year. So, because my first thoughts were, that's a big jump to go from 1 win to really at 6.5 wins on the over-under to have to win 7 games. How do you pick up 6 games with such a horrible team the previous year? But it has been done maybe about 60% of the time. Obviously, very limited sample size there, but that kind of shocked me a little bit that we've seen that big of a jump, teams that did so poorly. So it's not out of line to have them win 7 games. I just don't know where all the wins are going to come from because, again, I don't think they've done a lot with that defense. I will say, Chris said hurry up and wait. I think that's excellent advice. What I'll be looking at early on, I think they've got okay receivers if Lawrence can mesh with them. So maybe scoring some points, but their defense is going to give up points. They may play some higher scoring games, and we'll see how this goes as the season unfolds early on, but there might be some opportunities from that standpoint as well. But at the same time, if they play a really good defensive team, might shut that down. Maybe we get some value on the under if they are playing some high scoring games early on as well.
Yeah, and I'll be curious to see how their defense progresses over the course of the season because I see a bit of a parallel to something we talked about with the Vikings during our recent NFC North preview, and that would be the Jags. Having a young secondary, we might see some pretty decent development from them. Unlike the Vikings, however, Jacksonville has a new coaching staff, so the Vikings could see some big year 2 bumps with Mike Zimmer riding the ship. With the Jags, some new coaches might delay the progress a bit. So it'll be interesting to see how much the new staff is basically a reset for this young secondary or how much a second year in the league can help them maybe, step up a level or two to keep the team in some games, even if the offense isn't going crazy. All right. Well, I think that says it all for Jacksonville, guys. We can move on to the 4th and final team in the division. We've got a favorite here, the Tennessee Titans. We can look at their numbers, not just to win the division, but they might be in the mix to make a deeper run than that. 28-1 to win the Super Bowl, 14-1 to win the AFC. They're a -110 favorite to win the AFC South, and their regular season number sitting at 9.5, a bit of juice to the over at -120. And when we're looking at the Titans, Chris, we know they've made the playoffs the last couple years. They had a decent run to the AFC title game, but are they equipped to that next step and get over the hump this year? Or do you see any regression coming their way in Tennessee?
Well, I've named this team the Fast and the Furious team because, for obvious reasons, when you see these games with them, it's action-packed. But, as the years go by, the story doesn't get any better. The character changeover isn't any better. And you end up leaving disappointed. So I think it fits. Tennessee, I had rated just above Chicago, just above Cleveland last year. And if you don't agree with that, I was 6-1 with them. So anyway, there's a lot of good things to say about this team. Okay, I'm not going to waste the time with the stats. Henry, 2,000 yards. Tannehill, 33-7. We know how good they were on offense. They played nobody. They played one of the worst defensive schedules in the league. This year, they're playing one of the most difficult. So they lost their offensive coordinator, and the new offensive coordinator is in there saying he wants to make better use of Henry. How are you going to make better use of Henry after he's just had 2,000 yards and he's ran the ball probably as much as anybody since LaDainian Tomlinson? Are you going to just, chew this guy and ruin his career and spit him out? So
yeah, well, when it comes to Derrick Henry, I'll add a couple of numbers to put some context behind what you just said. I was also curious when I saw the comment about maximizing his role as if it wasn't already tapped out, because he has more than 780 carries the last 2 years, if we include the playoffs. And if we include receptions, that number goes to north of 800. So a lot of guys might be hitting a wall after a run like that. But, Derrick Henry, obviously a very special player, but is he a unicorn in the sense of maybe not hitting a wall quite yet, despite that big workload recently?
I think he can keep it coming. It's just, do you want this guy to have a future? I mean, we've seen we've seen how these running backs that are used that much last 3 years, not the traditional 5 years. So are you going to chew them up and spit them out? I mean, what are you going to do about your future? I mean, he's a great person. I mean, you need to spread it out.
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot to like about the offense, and if they can spread things out, that might give them more of a future. But Scott, I also know that you had some thoughts on the defense possibly being a key to a lot of the Titans' potential this season. Well,
last year they averaged just over a sack a game. So, and I don't know how much they've added there. Yes, they've added Bud Dupree. That will certainly help them a little bit, but I don't know that they've made enough moves on their defense to really improve their defense that much. I do think it's, the Derrick Henry comment, by the way, when Mike McCarthy went to Dallas last year, and say what you want about Mike McCarthy, whether you think he's a good coach or bad coach, let's just assume you think he's an offensive genius. That I'm not saying that, right? But what was he going to do to that Cowboy offense last year? Because in 2019, they were phenomenal on offense. So no matter how good he wasn't going to take that offense to another level. They had already kind of reached their elite level from an offensive standpoint. Just like Derrick Henry, he's done what he's going to do. And so I don't see how you're going to get any better with Derrick Henry, and to the point that you could overuse him, obviously. So I don't know that there's much to be gained from that side of it. And defensively, I don't know if they've made enough moves here. Somehow this team was plus 11 in turnovers last year and generated 15 interceptions while still just generating a little bit over a sack a game. So I don't know if they can duplicate that from a turnover standpoint. And if they don't do that, that plus 11 turnovers potentially comes down to a lower number. And I know when we look at the Pythagoreans, we'll see some other things that might suggest they regress. So I don't see upside for them on the defensive side. It seems like they really got the upside that they could get last year. To me, it's probably not as good defensively, and that could lead to some problems as well.
Well, they faced one of the easiest pass offensive schedules last year, and this year you've got the inverse situation. So all these horrible defensive metrics, I had them 29th in the league in defense. All these horrible metrics were against easy pass defenses. Now you're going to be facing one of the top schedules for passing offenses. So, I mean, boy, look at these quarterbacks. Anyway. So You sit there and you look at Indianapolis and you go, well, Tennessee's got to, run away with this division. But there's a lot of reasons. And don't ignore the turnover on this team. 12 of 22 starters have been replaced. That kind of changeover, along with the offensive coordinators, switch, that makes a difference. And then let's not forget, with that easy cakewalk schedule, they were 7-2 in close games. They're not going to get those breaks again. So there's a lot of reasons to think things can go south. Tannehill is due for serious regression. He's been one of the top statistical quarterbacks in the league for the last couple of years. It's like off the charts. And he can't keep it up. He just can't. And if they're expecting Julio Jones to come in and play in his prime, that's not going to happen.
Yeah, well, with Tannehill, I think you bring up an interesting point there. I know you've mentioned a stat talking about a previous quarterback when it comes to bad ball rate, which has been pioneered by data scientist Ed Fang. And that's basically looking at the percentage of pass attempts that get either intercepted or simply touched by a defender. And Ed has found that stat is actually more predictive year over year than interceptions themselves. And when we look at Tannehill, this gets really interesting because Tannehill has had a very low interception rate in recent years, but his bad ball rate has been above league average. So that's not to say that he hasn't been good and shown a lot of progress since escaping Adam Gase in Miami. I think we need to give Tannehill a lot of credit for the growth that he's shown as a quarterback, but that's not to say there hasn't been some luck thrown in as well.
Another horrible thing they were 18 for 26 on field goals. Is that correct?
I'll take your word for it.
Gutowski, 18 for 26 on field goals. I mean, unbelievable.
Well, I would say the other thing, too, that, Julio Jones has come in there, which is fantastic for him. But remember, they lost Jonnu Smith and Corey Davis. I think Corey Davis a little bit underrated. And, I always worry a little bit when guys have great seasons, go to another team. Was it a product of really being surrounded by other great players on their, original team? And can they duplicate that? But I think they take a step back despite getting Julio Jones. They probably take a step back from that standpoint as well, because they lost two very valuable players, within their receiver ranks as well.
Yeah, and I think that ties into a question. We have another good one from Birdie. And it says the Titans are favorites in 13 games this season, yet their win total is 10.5. Initially, I was thinking their win total over may be a look, but does 10.5 make sense given their favorites in 13, gift or trap? And I think that's a good way to frame this question. And guys, something that's come up as we've previewed most of the divisions to date is looking at some teams, the number of games they're favored in compared to their regular season win total. And I have had the thought come up a few times where, okay, if a team is favored in half its games and an underdog in half its games, that doesn't necessarily mean their win total should be exactly 500. I guess with a 17 game, that's a little weird this year. So let's say, 8.5 if they're favorites and underdogs an equal number of times, because what we could have is, just for simplicity's sake, every game they're favored, maybe they're favored by an average of 6 or 7. And when they're underdogs, it could be, 3 or less. And in that case, the win total should be higher to account for, each game being a certain fraction of a win. When it comes to the Titans, again, Birdie mentioned being favored in 13 games, yet the win total a good bit lower than that. What do you make of the Tennessee Titans win total entering 2021?
Well, first of all, I'll just say to your points, Matt, both Indianapolis and Tennessee have an average line of being favored by -1, according to my calculations, for all 18 games. So they're on the same level in terms of their average line. But to your point, Indianapolis is, I just did a quick count here, so I could be wrong in this, but Indianapolis is only favored in 8 games, but they're favored by more in some of those games, where to your point, Tennessee is favored by 3, 3.5, 3, 3.5. So they've got a lot of small favorites, and they're also small dogs. So even though they're favored by 10 points, if you look at straight up win percentages at the lines that they're favored by, it doesn't necessarily translate to them winning 11 games necessarily, because they're more likely to lose some of those favored games because they're just smaller favorites or they're on the road favored, et cetera.
Yeah, and I think if we take a look at the Pythagorean numbers now, that can also help to inform the approach in terms of what to expect with Tennessee this coming season. So, Scott, when we look at this chart one more time today for those watching on YouTube, what stands out when you look at the Titans numbers here?
Yeah, quite a bit. So they win 11 games last year. The Pythagorean is 9.1. That's a 16-game schedule. So when we translate that over 17 games, we're at 9.6, which puts us basically where they are for the season win number. But they overachieved by 1.9. 2 is kind of the key number for me that starts to translate to some, serious regression potential. So they're in that ballpark. And then 7-2 in close games, extremely lucky or fortunate, we should say, maybe in close games. So all of a sudden now, if 7-2 becomes 4-3, 5-4, for example, that's a 2-game swing, and they're only at 9 games. Add in that, their overall schedule is 24, so it's not super tough. They have 10 games against teams projected to win 8.5 or more games. So that's kind of your 8.5 and 8.5. But they have 12 games against teams projected to win 8 or more games. Chris kind of alluded to it. Last year, they played 8 teams that didn't make the playoffs. So even though they've got a couple games of teams that are projected to win less than 8.5 games, they're right in that neighborhood. So 12 of their 17 games could be considered to be fairly tough. They're not expected to have a great defense this year. Tannehill possibly regresses for all the reasons you mentioned. They're fortunate to win some of these close games. There is just some serious possible regression that could happen here, and I would lean under the 9.5 season wins. And Jacksonville only figures to be better just because obviously Houston figures to be worse, but Houston was bad last year anyway, so they might have a tougher slate, from that standpoint as well. So I would lean under in their season wins just because of all the above.
Yeah, and Chris, Scott touched on it being a tougher slate for the Titans this season. How do you see it shaping up for them with some thoughts about their draft and some new cast members as well?
Well, they had a really good draft. So that's one thing that they have going for them. They had a B- draft, and they did smart things. They took a cornerback that they needed. They took 2 wide receivers that they needed. They took the wrong ones. They could have taken better ones. They helped their offensive line and linebacker a little bit. And it looks like they picked up a kicker too, I guess. So I don't know whether he's going to be on the team. But and speaking of kickers, by the way, the Lions cut both of their kickers today. They have no kickers. So,
all right, the Lions mentioned cashes, -200. Lions mentioned every episode. I think we're undefeated so far.
43% of their roster is 24 years of age or younger. So obviously, I switched teams. I'm done with Tennessee. I think the only other thing I can say is they're always overvalued in the betting market because people like Tennessee. And there's just always extra value betting against Tennessee for some reason. They're just a darling.
Yeah, well, one final question I have for either of you. Let's make this open-ended, but one thing that stood out when I looked at the Titans at last count, kind of similar to Indy in the sense that I saw COVID protocols right now have 9 players and 3 coaches affected. What kind of impact do you see that having on the Titans in a year where, yes, COVID will still be a concern at sometimes, but it's not like 2020 where everybody is dealing with it to more or less the same extent. So when a team has some issues like this, just how impactful might that be?
I was at the Circa panel this past weekend with Michael Lombardi. I was chatting with him beforehand, and he really woke me up to that. He's like, you got to kind of watch out for Tennessee in these first couple of weeks because you just don't come back right away from this. And there may be some added value betting against. So I did take a mental note on that. I should have mentioned it earlier, but that's some good information, I think.
To that point, Chris, I think we learned that last year. Some players said that, it kicked the hell out of them. It took them a little while to come back. Now, the other side of that I would look at, if it's happening to a player who's vaccinated, it seems like the symptoms and whatnot are less heavy to someone that's been vaccinated versus someone that hasn't been. So maybe it'll be a little bit easier to come back from that, but that all remains to be seen. And I think something that has to be watched pretty closely.
Yeah, I think as we wrap up the Titans talk, one thing I would consider, we'll dive into, again, the whole week 1 slate next week, but Arizona coming to Tennessee, that line has been sitting on 3 for a good bit, and I've started to see some juice on the Cardinals. So if you're looking that way and the 3 starts to get away at some books, always advocate shopping lines. And if you're looking for Arizona, +3. We might not have until next week to pull the trigger on a flat +3. So something to keep in the back of your mind for a bit. And again, we'll make sure to revisit that one as we break down the week 1 board next week. At this stage, though, I think we can take a look at the overall odds for the AFC South one more time to revisit how the landscape looks. Tennessee, despite some possible regression headed their way, we know they're a very talented team. They have a great track record the last couple of years, so they are the favorite at -115. The Colts not too far behind at +130, Jacksonville at +650, and then Houston, way at the back of the bus, +2,500. So as we hit the home stretch here, guys, we can get into some leans. I don't think we have any bets we recommend making right now, but certainly some good food for thought as people, start to digest what we've talked about with the AFC South. And Scott, I'd like to start with you and a lean you had mentioned on the Jags. I think that was under 6.5 regular season wins at -130.
Yeah, under 6.5. I'm not sure where the 6 wins, 7 wins essentially will come from. The only reason it's a lean, not a bet, is just simply because the division is bad. I don't know what we get out of Tennessee and Indianapolis. They could pick up some wins there, but I would lean under the 6.5. It's going to take 7 wins, and I'm just not sure that they've done enough to pick up an extra 6 wins for them this year. But because the division is so bad, it's possible. So that makes it a lean as opposed to a best bet.
Yeah, and sticking with Jacksonville, I'll say that I totally hear you there, but I do lean their way when it comes to that division price of +650. And really, for me, it's all about the variance in play here. We talked about some regression that could be headed the Titans' way on offense. With the Colts, we're not sure if Wentz is the answer. The Texans are basically an afterthought at this point. And we've seen, some possible warts from Trevor Lawrence and Urban Meyer in the preseason. But if they pop in year 1, that might be enough to get them to the top of this division. I mean, Chris, you mentioned a couple NFC divisions being Yahtzee divisions. I'd say at this price tag, I'll take Jacksonville for my Yahtzee division being the AFC South. But the reason I do have that is just a lean is because we know the Jags offensive line could be quite an issue. They've already struggled to protect Lawrence throughout the preseason. One of their first rounders, Travis Etienne, out for the season already. And for me, it's almost always going to come down to the price. And the market has done a lot of catching up to this price tag for the Jags. It was north of a 10-1 payout earlier this offseason. And if we're looking at +650, that essentially equates to a break-even percentage of 13.3%. So if the Jags don't win the division at least 13.3% of the time, this is not a profitable wager. I would guess that maybe the true number for the Jags odds to win the division could be closer to 15%. So that's why I have a lean there, but not quite enough value to tie up bankroll on the Jags division number for the full season. Scott, I know you also had a lean on Tennessee, the last time we talked about. I think Birdie's question mentioned a win total of 10.5, but we've got 9.5 at BetUS. So even at that number, still leaning to the under.
Yeah, I would lean under 9.5, and boy, 10.5, I would take a shot at that for sure. But I just think there's a lot of signs, which doesn't always play out, right? But signs of regression here with this team. And because of that, I think under 9.5, we have a reasonable chance, and therefore the lean on the under as well.
Cool. And Chris, any leans for you on this division, or is it more of the same with hurry up and wait?
Wait, I don't know how Jacksonville's ever going to win 7 games. So I do lean under there. I actually feel like kind of an idiot for not betting it, but you know what? I just don't want the aggravation. Sometimes you don't have, I just don't want it. I don't know how to explain it. I just, like I said, I don't want to have it nagging in my head in any way, shape, or form. I probably should have a Jacksonville under ticket. But aside from that, nothing. Houston probably can't win either. But, if somehow Watson gets to play, then you're going to be really pissed you got that under ticket.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think one of the most prudent things we can do as bettors is be patient and pick our spots. We've talked about the books have to throw out a line for every game. And in this case, a line for every regular season win total, every division price, but we don't have to bet into everyone at this stage. I hope this has given everybody, again, some good food for thought as we get to the stage where pretty soon we'll have the opportunity to bet on or against each of these teams every week of the season. And on that note, I think that's going to, a lot of excitement from Chris for the AFC South. the juggernaut that is the AFC South. So on that note, I think we can go ahead and thank everybody for tuning in to the BetUS NFL show. If you have any thoughts, questions, or topic ideas for future videos, let us know in the comments of this video, or feel free to reach out on Twitter if you're listening to this in podcast form. Speaking of Twitter, you can find Chris at LasVegasCris. That's CRIS. You can find Scott at Sixth Sense NFL, and you can find me at mlandis18. And for those of you watching on YouTube, thanks for joining us today. You know the drill. Go ahead and subscribe to this channel. Give this video a thumbs up if you like what we're doing. And please hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on any of the action. Once again, starting next week, we'll be coming to you live on Tuesdays at 5:30 p.m. Eastern, 2:30 Pacific, as well as Fridays at noon Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific. As always, please come chat with us and let's have some fun together as we look for edges all season long. Last but not least, everybody, don't forget to use the promo code NFL2021 when signing up at BetUS to claim your 125% sign-up bonus. That's exclusive for sports betting, good up to $2,500. And one more reminder, everybody, we will be with you every Tuesday and Friday throughout the season. Next up this Friday, it's the NFC South. Maybe we're not saving the best division for last, but we have saved the defending champs for last. So we'll see you on Friday right back here at BetUS, where the game begins.